control the vertical.
Welcome to Anthologic, the TV anthology podcast. I am your host, Mark. Anthologic is a podcast dedicated to exploring the good, the bad, and the odd of horror, science fiction, and the best of mystery suspense anthology shows and series on TV. Join me as we slip through the cracks of reality to approach the extremes of experience, where we can peruse the stories and art of a sinister fairground of strange and wonderful rides. And now we go on to the show that is the focus of this particular episode. Welcome to this episode of Anthologic with your host Mark. Today I want to talk about an anthology series called One Step Beyond. This is an American anthology series, originally broadcast 3 seasons by the American Broadcasting Company, running from January to 1959 to July 1961. It also had a spin-off series, I think in the late 70s, called Next Step Beyond. So there was kind of a follow-up series, and one of the major creative elements was involved in both. Now, the major creative element I want to talk about is John Newland. Now, I knew of this show. It was on my radar. Never seen an episode. I bought the box set of that was relatively cheap from Amazon of 70 episodes. Now, this isn't the full list. There are 96 episodes for some reason. In this box set, there are this episode missing and that. I presume that they were lost through either bad record, being scrubbed, or some sort of rights issue or something like that. There are 17 about. Also, this series is on, for the UK anyway, on Amazon Prime for free. So it's available to watch. I must say I was impressed. I watched the pilot episode, which was called The Bride Possessed. Now, the premise of the episode was that a young, newly married bride, innocent, virginal, very sweet, suddenly becomes a totally different personality, and the plot develops. Before we get into this specific episode, let's go reel back and talk about One Step Beyond a little more. Now, this is often associated with the Twilight Zone in terms of people consider it to be kind of a rip-off or just occurring at the same time as the Twilight Zone, which is not true. This show was running on the air, had a full season out before the Twilight Zone premiere. This presented itself 10 months before the Twilight Zone, so that is not true. And in fact, Rod Serling contacted the main creative person, John Newland, arranged a dinner meeting with him and wanted to tell him about his own show and to assure him he wasn't trying to rip off One Step Beyond. That was quite an important thing, and John Newland spoke fondly of Rod Serling after this, saying, he was class all the way through. To be concerned and show concern and talk to someone like that was quite something. Now, originally, this show was actually, or when it first aired, it was known as Alcoa Presents. I believe Alcoa is like a tinfoil manufacturer. But when it went to syndication, they stopped calling it Alcoa Presents and just called it One Step Beyond. It was the full title was Alcoa Present One Step Beyond, but often it was called Alcoa Presents. How about that? And John Newland, who was a famous, at the time, a fairly well-known TV actor. He wasn't a movie actor, he was a TV actor who was involved in lots of different productions, dramas on TV, so he was a familiar face. But as an actor, he kind of involved himself in the creative process, directing and so on. He directed shows, some of the shows he was on. For example, the Loretta Young show, apparently he appeared on a few times, which was a sort of drama anthology, I believe. And he went on to direct some episodes, and he kind of learned his art. Now, in many ways, he's similar to Rod Serling in that they're a major creative element. Whereas Rod Serling is channeling himself through writing and ideas, and then passes it on to a director. John Newland takes other people's, comes up with, well, I'm not sure if he came up with ideas, but he certainly was the director side of it, but in a fairly profound and strong way. His direction is pretty good. From this first episode, he's pretty good, and apparently he's held in high regard. Now, this show, the premise is it tried to steer away from the fantastic, purely fantastic, and calls itself a show that's tried to present odd things that happen, but which are on the human record, is how they put it, on human record, i.e. they're based on what supposedly is a real life thing, and it pretty much deals with the paranormal. So this first episode is about possession, but there's also things like premonition, ghosts, weird coincidences, possibly astral projection in other episodes. So there's all sorts going on, but they aren't the same kind of area as something like The Outer Limits or Twilight Zone, that they restrict themselves into that space. It's not a well-known show, but really, spiritually, it feels like some sort of direct line from this to the X-Files. Now, I'm not sure the X-Files was specifically riffing on this, but honestly, in this episode I was thinking you could just drop Mulder and Scully into this episode and it would work very well as an X-Files episode. And reading some of the other synopses of other episodes, I get that feeling. It really is a strong sort of I wouldn't like to say grandparent, but I'd say weirdly similar to the space many X-Files episodes occupy. So, yeah, really interesting. Now, it was interesting how it was presented. John Newland faces the camera. There's a weird sort of shadow behind him of what looks like an arch window or a round window. It's almost like a web behind him. And I've seen this effect in other things. It's similar to what Alfred Hitchcock does. It really reminded me of the beginning of Plan 9 from Outer Space, where we get the TV psychic Criswell talking nonsense in that particular movie. However, it looked very similar to this. So they both came out in the same year, so I don't know if Ed Wood was copying this style, or if it just happens to be similar, or if they're both copied an earlier version of it. That's possible, and actually probably likely, actually. So it's presented this way. And John Newland's likable and he's got authority, so he works as a TV host. He fits well as a host of this kind of series for this one episode that I saw. All right, let's talk about the episode. Okay, so a bride possessed. Very interesting. It's basically a newly married couple. And the wife is from the south, so she's got a strong southern accent, and she's quite prim and proper, but she's also, happy to be on just starting her married life with her husband. Let's put it that way. But then the next morning she turns weird and odd, and she's not talking in the same accent. She's saying, "Go down this road. There's a house down here." And he's saying, "How do you know? Have you been here?" And she says, "No." And she's talking in a different way, and basically and it's weird that in many ways you could consider this episode like some sort of primal fear of marriage, like how when you marry someone they might change or there might be secrets. She's talking about making love to some other guy, for example. She's supposed to be a virgin, and is like, or it's implied that's the way, and he's very confused by this. And it turns out she's claiming to be a completely different woman who was murdered by her husband and knows details she should know. She gets treated by a psychiatrist who knew the original woman. She phones her own mother, who recognises her. This dead woman's mother, who recognises the voice of her daughter, and it goes on. Essentially, it gets resolved once her death, the circumstances of her death get sort of uncovered, and the guilty parties get, their comeuppance. And it resolves. I liked it. It was really strong, actually. I would thoroughly recommend anyone watching this first episode. If you've got Prime, it was, and I'm glad I bought the box set, and I will be watching more of this. I think this is a very strong series. Apparently, it ran out of steam towards the end because I think the producer was saying, "Well, look, there's basically 15 stories of the parent, and there's 15 kind of stories we do, and we've already yeah, we've done 60 odd shows and we're going to do another more. But they did something interesting in season 3. They actually transplanted to the UK because they felt there was another pool of actors they could use there. And apparently it's really good. You know, things like Christopher Lee's in it, for example. But there's also people like William Shatner, Elizabeth Montgomery, the sort of actors you'd recognise from shows like Star Trek and so on from the 60s. Lois Maxwell stars in one of the episodes, for example, you know, Moneypenny. And we also get Andre Morel in one, who was one of the Quatermasses in one of the TV Quatermass versions. So there's all sorts of interesting actors in this series, certainly in the last series. But having said that, there is interesting actors all through it. So it's worth a look. It's definitely worth some time, and I would recommend it. I also did manage to find quite an interesting guide on Kindle. There's a paperback version, but it's out of print and it's very expensive, called An Analytical Guide to Television's One Step Beyond. That's quite a mouthful. But I use it as some of my background research, so I just wanted to credit that book, written by John Kenneth Muir, who writes a lot of genre TV books. And his style is not quite my cup of tea, but it's certainly informative. So I would recommend, if you write this series and you really want to delve into it, that's an interesting book too. So this is a big recommend for me. A good series, for one of the more pleasant surprises in my journey through the world of TV anthology. Really pleased that I got to this, and I will be covering more at some point in the future. Oh, in addition, I mentioned it was on Prime. It is on YouTube. There's quite a lot of episodes on YouTube too. So you could go through that route if you haven't got Prime. So that is available. So once more, a big recommend for me. And I'm going to say bye-bye. And one final question. Is anybody out there?
I'm not.
We now return control of your television set to you until next week at this same time, when the control voice will take you to